If you want proof that a person's worth isn't their job, watch Matthew slip through that side door. He wore a blue janitor uniform, pushing a cleaning cart. A tiny photo of his 7-year-old daughter, still fast asleep back home. People ignore what they think doesn't matter. Nobody even glanced his way. To them, he was just the guy mopping the floors. They saw him as invisible, but at 1:58 that afternoon, the big boss's translator vanished. The Korean corporate delegation was already sitting down. $50 million was waiting. The only person in that entire office who spoke fluent Korean was the exact same janitor who just finished mopping the floor under their expensive shoes. They had dismissed his actual worth for 14 solid months. It would take just one chaotic afternoon to regret that mistake. Outside, the Chicago weather was acting up like typical early spring. Wind off the lake slammed against the office glass with a heavy, stubborn push. The morning sky held that unique, deep, dark blue color. Not really night anymore, but barely even morning either. Down below on Michigan Avenue, early delivery drivers were kicking off their routes. Up on the 18th floor, Matthew blocked out the city noise completely. He just heard the quiet hum of the building, the rhythm of his chores, and felt the picture in his pocket. Tucked safely inside the left chest pocket of his uniform. That cheap, faded blue shirt with the cleaning service patch stitched on the chest hid a folded photograph, proof there is always more to a person. The picture itself was no bigger than a playing card. It showed 6-year-old Bonnie sitting on their Lincoln Park apartment steps, laughing hard at something just out of the frame. Both front teeth were completely missing. Her hair sat in messy braids, since he never really learned the proper technique. He watched tons of tutorials but still failed. He carried that picture every single shift. You and I know that small private rituals keep a person grounded when the world just sees a uniform. Matthew Cole was 36 years old. He stood 6 feet tall, a lean, quiet frame built not from trying to look good at the gym, but from carrying heavy loads for years, both physical and emotional. The mop handle left his palms completely calloused and rough. But there was a faded ink stain on his left index finger, a stubborn mark that endless scrubbing with cheap industrial soap could never wash away. That stain proved he used to sign critical paperwork every single day of his life. Contracts, translation certificates, and classified reports. For 8 solid years, Matthew served as a high-level military translator for the Department of Defense. Level 4 Korean expert. Barely 300 people in the whole country held that elite certification at the absolute highest grade. He sat across from high-ranking generals and foreign trade ministers, working in hidden Seoul basements and shiny glass buildings across Washington. And he didn't just translate words, he translated human intention. You and I know the trick is finding the true meaning between what people say and actually want. He walked away from that entire life in 2021. His wife got sick in January and passed away by October. Little Bonnie was only 4 years old. He never really had a choice. High-paying private translation gigs vanished way faster than he ever saw coming. The freelance market for top-tier Korean translators was extremely narrow. You and I know high-paying agencies demand travel and extended trips. Sudden deployments, spending weeks far away from home. That just wasn't an option with a 4-year-old girl who still woke up crying for a mother who was forever gone. So he took the most practical job available. Cleaning offices, quiet hours, zero drama, and a reliable check every 2 weeks. It paid the rent, supported Bonnie, and slowly built up a tiny savings account. He never complained. Whining just wasted energy that a single dad desperately needed. This cleaning company paid him just $19 an hour. A massive drop from his former professional salary. A janitor's uniform never dictates a person's brilliance. He knew his true capability, but worth and wages are completely different things, and he never confused them. Because what this humble work offered was absolute stability for Bonnie. His assigned building was right near her school, meaning he could easily walk her to class whenever he caught the early shift. Plus, there is true dignity in doing honest work perfectly, even in the shadows. He fundamentally understood that a fancy job title doesn't guarantee competence, just as a broom doesn't mean a lack of talent. He'd watched too many powerful corporate executives fumble basic tasks to ever believe otherwise. That Tuesday morning, he arrived early to prep the 18th floor for something huge. the main corporate boardroom down at the east hallway's end. The grand suite facing Michigan Avenue was staged for a massive afternoon business negotiation. He personally lined up every chair the previous night, and now he meticulously polished the top of the massive table until it mirrored the overhead lights like still glass. He neatly organized the cables. He carefully aligned the thick document stacks left behind by the stressed administrative staff. He completely ignored the pages, title or not, a real professional respects boundaries. Then he rolled his cart to the service lift and hit the 15th floor button. He figured his job in that high-stakes room was completely finished today. But stick with me here, because what went down next shocked absolutely everyone involved. Meanwhile, CEO Eleanor Voss had been wide awake since 3 a.m. That early start was totally normal for her, but today held a different weight. She didn't just get up in the dark to skim reports or answer emails. She had just been lying in the dark of her apartment on the 32nd floor of a high-rise 3 blocks away, staring at the ceiling with that brutal clarity that has absolutely nothing to do with normal insomnia and everything to do with knowing exactly what's on the line. The Hansung Pacific merger, that was keeping her eyes open. Eleanor Voss was 38. Yet she built Voss Capital from a tiny regional advising group into one of the most highly regarded wealth management firms across the entire Midwest. She achieved this success through sharp precision and quiet patience, and the guts to make massive calls that terrified folks would delay for weeks. She was never reckless, she was just decisive. There's a huge difference there. Not every corporate employee caught that nuance, but those who respected the grind eventually figured it out. This giant Hansung Pacific deal was the biggest single business transaction in Voss Capital's history. $50 million in logistics investments spread across 3 years. Eleanor spent 2 quiet years building this gateway into the East Asian market. She did the heavy lifting nobody ever notices. Closing this contract would completely change the entire company's future. It would finally quiet those board members who exactly 6 weeks prior made a move. Voted to strip her solo signing power for what they smugly called a strategic review. Eleanor knew exactly what that meant. They were waiting for her to fail. One tiny slip and those executives would pounce. She arrived at 7 in the morning, wearing a simple white shirt under a stark black blazer. Hair tied back tight, already scanning the overnight reports on her phone screen. Her assistant Sophia was already there. You and I know assistants really run the world. She held the morning briefing and a fresh cup of coffee, keeping things moving. Richard strolled in 11 minutes later. He strutted with that blind confidence of a guy whose biggest daily struggle is picking a tie. 44 years old, impeccably dressed. And he carried his vice president title like a massive gold crown for 6 years. He did decent work, mostly. You and I have met guys like him. He judged folks by their paycheck, and never once entered a meeting without assuming he was the single most vital person there. That arrogance molded his character in ways he was completely blind to. He assured Eleanor the interpreter was officially confirmed. Daniel Marsh, a seasoned Korean interpreter with 12 years navigating tense corporate negotiation rooms. Richard secured him 2 weeks ago. The paperwork was completely signed. Everything seemed perfect. Eleanor simply nodded and kept her words brief. Sophia quietly passed over another memo. Eleanor grabbed it, though she kept her gaze locked on Richard a second too long. She knew better than to trust executives who spoke with absolute, unshakable certainty. That overconfidence is usually the very last warning sign before disaster strikes. At 11:47 in the morning, just 2 hours and 13 minutes before the Hansung Pacific executives were due, Sophia got a call. She picked up on the second ring. The voice on the line sounded incredibly tense. It had that dull edge of pain folks use when fighting to sound perfectly fine, but failing miserably. It was the interpreter, Daniel. He just survived a nasty wreck on the interstate. His vehicle was completely crushed. He was sitting inside Northwestern Memorial Hospital's emergency room. He swore he was fine, treating his own health like a secondary business concern. He could not attend the 2 o'clock meeting. Sophia froze in her chair for 3 seconds. Then she marched straight over to Eleanor's office and shoved the door open, skipping the knock. She had only done that twice in 4 whole years. Eleanor absorbed the bad news silently, then asked a single question. What were their options? Sophia was already dialing numbers while walking away from her desk. Two of Chicago's three biggest language agencies had zero backup translators ready on 2 hours' notice. The third agency had someone, but they were stuck in Boston and could never fly out in time. An independent contractor they trusted was technically reachable, but entirely booked until the evening. Look at that irony. Zero backup options remained. Richard answered a frantic text, rushing to Eleanor's door while clumsily buttoning his expensive suit. Someone actually suggested using software. A translation app paired with a junior staffer. Eleanor shot him a withering look that required absolutely 0 words. They both knew Theodore Wu, the boss of the Hansong Pacific team, had completely abandoned talks with a German company last year simply because they tried that exact same lazy shortcut. Wu had sent one single letter, a formal letter afterward declaring that relying on any machine translation during face-to-face deal-making was a deep form of institutional disrespect. That severe warning had spread across every corporate development desk across the North American Pacific trade route within 7 days. The 18th floor buzzed with the heavy tension of absolute, controlled panic. Assistants scrambled in tight circles, people whispered quietly. 2 senior associates poked their heads out of doors, then quickly retreated, realizing this disaster was way above their corporate pay grade. Meanwhile, Matthew Cole pushed his service cart down the hall towards the 11th floor, pausing without entirely knowing why. The heavy boardroom door had been left slightly open. Through that tiny crack, he caught pieces of their frantic discussion. Eleanor speaking sharp and tight, Sophia talking way too fast. Underneath it all, the clear sound of wealthy people, trapped with 0 solutions. He caught the word interpreter. He distinctly heard the word Korean. He caught the phrase 2 hours. Matthew froze, his hands gripping the cart handle. He glanced down the long hallway, checking both left and right. Not a single soul was around. Let us watch closely now. He stood there for maybe 6 seconds, debating his next move, knowing full well that stepping in was a terrible idea. Then he raised a hand and knocked firmly on that boardroom door. Everything stopped when the janitor entered. Eleanor stood frozen at the head of the table. Sophia hovered near the glass, her smartphone clutched tightly. Richard was hovering near the door to the side prep room. When Richard spotted Matthew, sizing up the uniform and that cleaning cart outside, his face instantly shifted into arrogant dismissal. Matthew didn't bother waiting to be introduced. He spoke up calmly, stating plain as day that he heard they desperately needed a Korean translator. Richard rudely ordered him out, but the man in the uniform stayed put. Instead, he reached right into his blue work shirt and pulled out his smartphone. The screen showed a picture of a Level 4 Department of Defense military translation badge. Korean language from 2013, renewed yearly through 2021. He slid the glowing device right onto the polished mahogany table. He casually mentioned spending 8 years doing translations for the Pentagon. He managed corporate treaty talks along with heavy bilateral military logistics deals, plus 2 huge rounds of trade talks directly involving Hansong Pacific's local branch in Busan. He dropped that final detail without any bragging. The exact way someone speaks when their pure competence shatters your shallow judgments completely. The room fell dead silent. Sophia lunged for her mobile device. You and I see the truth now. Within 90 seconds, she pulled up an old but undeniable professional profile. But his record was still live and legible. 8 solid years at the Department of Defense. He left in the autumn of 2021. His title wasn't janitor. It read Senior Interpreter Korean and Japanese for high-stakes diplomatic negotiations. The page showed 0 recent activity. No new connections added, no recent updates anywhere. A frozen snapshot of a brilliant career, set aside and untouched while he quietly pushed a mop to pay bills. Sophia handed Eleanor the screen, whispering that this impressive background was completely genuine. Richard quickly pulled Eleanor aside. He spoke low, but his judgmental words weren't meant to carry, but they did. He insisted she couldn't bring a mere janitor into a $50 million negotiation. Richard claimed this massive deal wasn't the time for social experiments. He couldn't see the man behind the uniform. He argued the clients would spot the uniform, or sense something was completely out of place. and that they'd lose the deal before anyone even read the first clause. Eleanor let him finish complaining. Then she looked at Matthew. She didn't ask about his cleaning cart. She simply asked why he knocked on that door. Matthew stood quiet for a moment. You and I know that kind of real pause. Though Hessenschirkanui drops the mask and decides to offer only pure truth. He quietly explained he had sat in high-stakes rooms just like this. He knew the exact devastating cost when one single mistranslation unraveled everything. A fragile deal that two sides spent months desperately building toward. He refused to stand by and watch that happen, not if he could stop it. Eleanor studied the man, not the uniform, for a long moment. Then she faced Sophia. Glancing at the wall clock, she asked Matthew a crucial question. Did he own a suit? He said no. Without hesitating, she ordered Sophia to go find him one. They found a suit in the closet of a former associate who had left a spare jacket and trousers hanging there after a late corporate event 2 years back. It fit Matthew with the kind of accidental precision that felt like fate stepping in. He changed in the staff restroom up on the 18th floor. Right before he buttoned that jacket, he carefully took his daughter's photo from his old work shirt and tucked it securely inside the pocket of that borrowed blazer. He had no real reason to study his own reflection in that mirror. But he looked anyway. Staring back was a brilliant professional he hadn't seen in years. He sent a quick text message to his friendly neighbor, Mrs. Wilson. He asked if she could grab Bonnie from school at 3:30. Then he walked right back down the hall toward that conference room. The Hansong Pacific delegation arrived precisely at 1:58 that afternoon. Theodore Wu stepped out through the elevator doors first. He was 52 years old. Compact and deliberate. Watch how he moves. This is a man who strictly conserves his energy for the exact moment it counts. Right behind him walked Charles Min, the team's lead contract attorney, holding a slim leather portfolio and wearing an expression of professional neutrality so intensely refined it looked almost architectural. Eleanor greeted them warmly at the elevator. Introductions were formal and highly measured. And this is the part we love. She introduced Matthew by name alone. No job title, no context, no apology. Matthew offered Theodore Wu his hand, delivering 4 flawless sentences in Korean. His phrasing was perfectly formal and sharp. Exactly the tone senior executives expect at a tense, high-stakes initial meeting. Never stiff, never casual. He calibrated the exact level of respect this massive deal demanded. Theodore Wu shook his hand and then did something surprising. Something he had not done since entering the building. He paused. He stared right at Matthew. You and I recognize that look, a powerful man realizing he severely underestimated the hired help. Charles Min offered him a slightly deeper bow than he gave Eleanor. A detail only visible to someone truly paying attention. Richard, standing safely at the edges of the greeting, was definitely watching. His face stayed blank, but his eyes betrayed a shift. The executives finally sat down. Eleanor claimed the head of the table. Sophia flanked her right side, her tablet ready. Richard grabbed a chair along the side. Matthew took the corner seat, bridging Eleanor and the powerful Hansong delegation. The invisible spot, where an interpreter sits to translate instantly, perfectly angled so the big bosses never have to look past the hired help. The opening banter was formal. Eleanor laid out the framework of the proposed partnership. Matthew translated every section flawlessly, and in doing so, he made brilliant adjustments invisible to everyone except Theodore Wu, softening the bluntness of Eleanor's American corporate cadence into the deeper, relationship-focused tone that Korean corporate culture views not as dodging, but as deeply respectful, weight-bearing language. He never altered the actual substance of what Eleanor said. He rebuilt the architecture around it, proving the real power often sits in the background. You and I know how crucial this is. The message crossed the language barrier, keeping its meaning, but arrived perfectly dressed. Theodore Wu just listened. He would occasionally interject in Korean, and Matthew fired those responses back to Eleanor without a single hesitation. 40 minutes into the session, they hit the exact clause that Matthew had warned them about in the prep room. The profit-sharing provision for year 1 of this massive partnership. The English draft read as a perfectly even split. The corresponding Korean version, drafted by the Hansong legal team, used a legal term that carried a default assumption of priority weighting, favoring the originating party during that very first fiscal period. It was not a glaring discrepancy and perhaps not even intentional. These subtle traps always build up in complex bilingual contracts, just like tiny errors compounding in a massive calculation. But if this flaw went unnoticed until long after the final ink dried on the signatures, let's be real here, it would trigger a vicious dispute costing both sides far more money than it was ever worth. Charles Min proudly read the clause aloud from his version. Richard was nodding before the translation was even finished. The empty nod of a big shot hearing the sound of the words, entirely missing their actual meaning. The unseen interpreter placed one hand on the table. He calmly announced he needed to pause and clarify a critical point before anyone moved forward. He spoke right to Charles Min in Korean, completely bypassing Eleanor. That is exactly the right move when an interpreter spots a hidden flaw. Let's watch this closely. He tapped the exact Korean phrase and explained. Using flawless legal Korean, he showed how it completely missed the English clause and exactly what the massive ripple effects of that error meant. Dead silence hit the boardroom. Charles Min just stared at his own document. Then he glanced up at Theodore Wu and fired off something in Korean. A quick remark, Theodore Wu replied just as fast. Then Theodore locked eyes with Matthew, asking in Korean how on earth he knew to catch that detail. Matthew replied in fluent Korean, keeping it completely natural and unforced. He calmly said he had been in enough rooms just like this one to spot the real difference between a simple accident and true intention, and that knowing the difference actually meant absolutely everything. A heavy pause hung in the air, lasting far longer than a casual silence. Then, Theodore Wu did something every single person at that table suddenly noticed. People read it differently based on their own blind spots. The man smiled. This was not that fake, polished corporate smirk you see during standard business negotiations. It was something completely genuine. The rare look of someone who suddenly recognizes true, massive value where they least expected it. He gave a single nod. Richard stared down at the table. During the quick break, as Sophia guided the Hansung team into the next lounge area, Richard cornered Matthew right over by the large window. His tone sounded quiet and tight. But you and I know insecurity when we hear it leaking through a mask. He warned Matthew not to misunderstand his actual place here. He bluntly said Matthew's brilliant save in that boardroom meant absolutely nothing to his status. Once this wrapped up, Matthew would return to his bottom-tier day job. He arrogantly told Matthew to remember his lowly rank. Matthew just watched him, absolutely no anger, no need to defend himself. He had heard this elitist garbage before, back in the army and government halls. In places where entitled people felt threatened just by having real talent in the room. He always found that petty arrogance tiring, never actually hurtful. He calmly replied that he already knew his own worth perfectly well. And the real issue was whether Richard realized he desperately needed Matthew right now. Then, he just turned and walked right back toward the boardroom door. The back half of the negotiation got incredibly messy. Theodore Wu dropped a brand new trap that wasn't in any early paperwork. An intense exit clause letting Hansung Pacific completely back out within 18 months if certain supply chain targets fell short of a very strict performance baseline. It was a massive game changer. And he timed it perfectly to prove this was a calculated strike, not some mistake. Eleanor had zero warning about this sneaky addition. She was flying completely blind here. She took Matthew's translation and kept a poker face, but she was desperately stalling for time. We are about to see real value tested in that split second before Eleanor's answer. Matthew whispered 3 quick sentences meant only for her ears. He told her this kind of exit clause was standard practice for their Asian business partners. He promised her it wasn't a trap. He explained it was merely a test. The side willing to accept it was considered a true partner, proving they valued real action over simply hiding behind contracts. Eleanor took that in. She studied Matthew for just a split second. Then she faced Theodore Wu, calmly announcing their firm accepted the new terms. Theodore Wu slowly shut his copy of the thick paperwork. He turned to Charles Min and spoke one sentence in Korean. Matthew quickly translated the phrase into English for Eleanor. his tone perfectly steady. He explained that Wu just told his partner they finally found the right person. Richard just stared down at the table for a long time after hearing that. Think about this. They signed the agreement at 4:37 inside that exact same conference room where Matthew arranged chairs and wiped down the wood just 9 hours earlier. Theodore Wu signed first, followed by Eleanor. Charles Min watched while Sophia recorded it. Afterward, Theodore Wu stood up and stared right at Matthew across the long table. He spoke in Korean. Matthew translated for everyone without a hint of emotion. The strictly neutral tone of someone doing a job, even when praised to their face. He informed Eleanor that Theodore Wu specifically wanted him sitting in on the big contract talks scheduled for the very next month. Eleanor calmly replied that they could arrange that. Once the guests were walked to the elevators and the big room totally cleared out, it was just Eleanor and the interpreter, with that massive table between them and the fading afternoon sunlight spilling through those south-facing windows, bringing that specific, heavy silence of a space where something massive had just gone down. Richard walked out without a single word. The door clicked shut behind him, the sound of a guy realizing his tough conversation would just have to wait for another day. Eleanor finally sat back down, not in her usual powerful stance at the head of the table. No longer the boss reviewing results, but resting further down the long side. Leaning back in her chair like someone does when the corporate show is over and only the real human being is left sitting there. She looked genuinely deeply exhausted. She quietly asked Matthew why he ever left his government job. He took a seat too, but not directly across from her, but right beside her, slightly angled. The exact way normal people sit when they aren't holding a corporate meeting. He said his wife died in 2021. He dropped the fact with zero sugarcoating. He mentioned Bonnie was only 4. That explained his choices way better than any fancy resume ever could. You and I have seen people dodge heavy truths, but Eleanor just absorbed it quietly. She stared down at his rough hands on the wood, the tough calluses marking the base of every finger, the faded ink stain on his left index finger, proof that a job title never tells the whole story. She claimed he tossed aside a massive career just to scrub corporate floors. He corrected her. He left that corporate life behind simply to raise his little girl. Scrubbing floors was just a paycheck. A person's true worth isn't their job title. Eleanor sat in absolute stunned silence. She just folded her hands, staring out at the skyline below, completely lost in thought. Then Sophia knocked and stepped inside. She announced the foreign delegation was ready for goodbyes, and the executive transport was waiting. Eleanor got up, so did Matthew. Glancing down at that borrowed suit jacket, he quietly offered to hand it back. Eleanor insisted he keep it on for the rest of the business day. Stick with me here. Richard Harlan's fate over the next few days wasn't explosive. Eleanor never dragged him into her office for a loud, messy showdown. No official write-up, absolutely no shouting, and zero unnecessary boardroom drama. Instead, she executed a perfectly quiet corporate restructuring. Within days of the executive board reviewing that massive Hansung negotiation outcome, Richard was quietly shipped off to lead the Domestic Portfolio Advisory Group. A fancy corporate title, sure, but completely stripped of any real institutional power. It wasn't an outright firing, it was recalibration. That was Eleanor's leadership style. She didn't seek revenge, she simply rearranged. Sophia casually mentioned the sudden staff reassignment to Matthew on a Thursday afternoon, right outside the main executive administrative suite. Matthew absorbed the news, simply stating he hoped Richard would find value in the role. He meant it. He found zero joy in seeing another man diminished. That massive formal contract signing with Hansung Pacific was set for next month. Eleanor was already pushing paperwork to give Matthew's immense talents a formal position. Director of East Asian Partnerships, a real title, an executive contract, actual pay, plus a scope of real responsibilities stretching far beyond one lucky afternoon translating. Exactly 8 days after the signing, a premium cream-colored envelope landed directly on Eleanor's desk. It held a business card alongside a thin paper note written in beautifully precise handwriting. The message was entirely in Korean. Eleanor immediately walked it over to Matthew. He scanned the words while standing quietly, right in her office doorway. warm late afternoon sunlight spilling into the room from right behind him. He stayed completely silent for a beat after finishing, then he translated it. Here's where you and I see real value. Theodore Wu wrote that great interpreters don't translate words. They translate the pure intentions of people. He revealed that Wu was deeply thankful she sent the truly right person. Eleanor gently took the paper back, perfectly folding it along its original delicate crease. Sliding open her top right desk drawer, she tucked the note safely away, closing it without saying a single word. Later that same Friday evening, Matthew finally walked out of the Voss Capitol building at exactly 5:32. He strolled through the main lobby, exiting those wide glass doors facing Michigan Avenue. Skipping the hidden service alley he had quietly used every morning for 14 straight months. The front doorman gave a respectful nod. Matthew nodded back. He casually walked those 3 short blocks toward the parking garage. Think about it as we wrap up. He passed that janitorial window knowing honest work holds real dignity. A cleaning cart just like his old one sat by the door, its mop handle propped against the wall. He stared at it for a second, never breaking stride. When he got home, Bonnie was there with Mrs. Wilson. She sat on the kitchen floor in her pajamas, though it was only 6 o'clock in the evening, sorting a pile of bottle caps into a pattern that only she truly understood. When the door clicked open, she glanced up. No greeting, just told him he looked different. He asked her what she meant. She said she couldn't explain it, just different. He sank onto the floor next to her, loosened his work tie, and studied the little bottle cap design. He asked what she was building. She told him it wasn't building at all. It was organizing. He smiled and said he understood the difference. Later that night, once Bonnie fell asleep and the apartment went completely quiet, Matthew sat alone at the kitchen table, just him and a glass of water. No phone, no corporate documents, just the quiet hum of the building settling around him. The pipes rattling. The neighbor's television playing through the wall. The occasional car driving past. He thought of Eleanor Voss in her glass office, towering over a city blind to her deep exhaustion. He pictured Theodore Wu's handwriting, careful and deliberate, pressed onto thin paper. He remembered the slight, careful way Charles Men adjusted his bow. A tiny shift that carried massive weight, even if the executives in the room were totally blind to it. He thought about Richard Harlan, and how a powerful man could spend decades reading rooms, yet completely ignore the working-class guy who held the answers. He thought about Clara, like he always did when a day was special enough that he desperately wanted to share it with her. He thought of little Bonnie sleeping nearby, who had looked past his uniform to see the quiet change in him, and then went back to her organizing without demanding any kind of explanation. Kids don't need complex explanations, they just need pure presence. They need a parent to sit on the floor and take their tiny, beautiful world seriously, piece by piece. For 14 months, that corporate building treated him like a ghost. He walked those halls without a name or respect, judged entirely by his uniform. He had silently scrubbed the very tables where the executives made their massive choices, heading home long before the press releases went out. Think about that with me. One boardroom door gets left open and the entire power dynamic flips. Sitting alone at that table, he honestly had no clue if this newfound respect would actually last. The actual agreement wasn't signed yet. The official corporate negotiations were 30 days away. Society has a nasty habit of pushing working-class heroes back into their assigned boxes, no matter how brilliant they prove themselves to be. But he had been inside that room. He had sat right at that table. He watched a $50 million deal survive, simply because he knew the quiet space between 2 languages carries weight. It holds all the hidden truths people are afraid to say directly. And it takes a very special kind of listener to actually hear it. Here is the truth. He was the exact same brilliant man who pushed a mop at 5:20 that morning. He was still the loving father whose daughter sometimes kept him awake late at night by calling out in the dark for a mother who could no longer answer her. Look, job title doesn't define someone. He was still the exact same man carefully transferring that frayed photograph between his pockets every single day. His core character never changed. What shifted was simply this. Someone with the power to recognize his true potential beyond his daily tasks finally paid attention. He grabbed his phone and fired off one quick text message to Sophia. He promised to arrive by 8 o'clock the next morning. Flicking off the kitchen light, he wandered down the narrow hall, pausing silently in the doorway to check on little Bonnie. She rested soundly on her side, one small arm hanging off the mattress edge with relaxed fingers. The gentle rhythm of her breathing took over the quiet space. He lingered in the doorway for a bit, grounded, fully present. Just showing up. Ultimately, that proves a person's real measure anyway. This professional interpreter, spending a lifetime bridging gaps between strangers, had slowly learned a vital lesson. After paying a heavy price, he realized your value isn't about the clever words you speak. It boils down to whether you actually stand by the people who rely on you. He was finally standing tall. For tonight, that was plenty. Tomorrow, he would march right through those front corporate doors again. He would ride the elevator up to the 18th floor. He would settle at a desk inside an office that finally displayed his actual name outside. Not just faceless staff anymore, his own real name. Then he would dive into prepping for the most crucial corporate negotiation of this new career chapter. You and I know he'd tackle it with the same dignity he brought to his humble tasks. Because human worth is never something that changes just because you finally sit in a fancy corporate executive chair. And somewhere in his jacket pocket, folded up nice and small, little Bonnie would be laughing, with her missing teeth and lopsided braids, silently anchoring his whole world, just like always, without even realizing how much she mattered.